April 18, 1943, 7:33 a.m. Bougainville Island, Solomon Island. The morning sun cuts through the tropical haze over the South Pacific. Two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers slice through the air at 4,500 feet, their engines humming in perfect. Inside the lead aircraft, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto gazes out at the emerald jungle below, unaware that 16,000 feet above him, 80 American P-38 Lightning fighters are descending like hawks toward their prey. In exactly 12 minutes, the architect of Pearl Harbor will be dead, and the course of the Pacific War will shift forever. If you want to discover how one of history's most daring assassination missions unfolded, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us which World War II operation you want us to cover next. Now, let's dive into one of the most precisely executed military operations of World War II. This is not just the story of a dogfight. This is the story of how American codebreakers, flying aces, and one fateful decision by a Japanese admiral converged in the skies over the Solomon Islands to change the trajectory of World War II. This is the story of Operation Vengeance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not just another military commander. He was the mastermind behind Japan's most devastating strike against America. The man whose strategic genius had brought the United States Navy to its knees on December 7, 1941. At 59 years old, Yamamoto stood as the supreme commander of the combined fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. He was a man of contradictions, educated at Harvard, fluent in English, and deeply familiar with American industrial might. Yet devoted entirely to the emperor and the expansion of the Japanese Empire. But on this particular morning, Yamamoto's reputation for punctuality would become his death sentence. The Japanese High Command had planned a morale-boosting tour for their most celebrated admiral. Yamamoto would visit frontline bases in the Solomon Islands, inspecting troops, meeting with commanders, and reinforcing Japanese resolve in a region where American forces were beginning to push back. The tour was meant to be a show of strength, a reminder that Japan's greatest military mind was personally overseeing operations in the South Pacific. What the Japanese didn't know was that American intelligence had been reading their mail for months. Rewind to April 13th, 1943, 5 days before Yamamoto's flight. Deep in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts hunched over decoded Japanese transmissions. The team, working under the ultra-secret MAGIC program, had cracked Japan's JN-25 naval code, giving American commanders an unprecedented window into enemy operations. On this particular day, they intercepted something extraordinary, a detailed itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour. The message was specific, dangerously specific. It included departure times, aircraft types, the number of escort fighters, and even the exact minute Yamamoto would arrive at each location. The Japanese, confident in the security of their codes, had handed the Americans a blueprint for assassination. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence officer, rushed the decoded message to his superior. As Nimitz read the details, the weight of the decision ahead settled over the room like fog. Here was an opportunity that might never come again, a chance to eliminate the man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, the commander whose strategic brilliance had wreaked havoc across the Pacific for 16 months. But killing Yamamoto came with risks. If the mission failed, the Japanese would know their codes were compromised. They would change their encryption methods, and America would lose its most valuable intelligence asset in the Pacific. The decision required authorization from the highest level. Nimitz sent the proposal up the chain of command, all the way to Washington, all the way to the desk of President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt's response was swift and unambiguous. Get Yamamoto. The mission fell to the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. These were not ordinary pilots. They were veterans of some of the most brutal air combat in the Pacific, men who had survived the crucible of the Guadalcanal campaign, where American and Japanese forces had fought for control of a single airstrip with an intensity that shocked even hardened military observers. Major John W. Mitchell would lead the mission. At 30 years old, Mitchell was a careful planner. A man who understood that success in aerial combat came not from reckless bravery, but from meticulous preparation. He gathered his pilots and laid out the problem. Yamamoto would be flying 435 miles from Rabaul to Bougainville over open ocean and an enemy-controlled territory. The Americans would have to fly at wavetop level to avoid Japanese radar, navigate without landmarks for over an hour and a half, arrive at precisely the right moment, and then fight their way out through superior numbers of Japanese fighters. Oh, and they would have to do all of this at the absolute limit of their aircraft's fuel range. There would be no margin for error, no fuel for extended combat, no room for getting lost. They would have one chance. Mitchell selected 18 P-38 Lightnings for the mission. The P-38 was the only American fighter with the range to reach Yamamoto's flight path and return. With its distinctive twin-boom design and twin engines, the Lightning was faster than Japanese Zeros at high altitude and could sustain damage that would down a single-engine fighter. But this mission would push even the P-38's capabilities to the breaking point. The strike force would split into two groups. 16 aircraft would fly as the covering force, ready to engage any Japanese fighters that rose to defend Yamamoto's bombers. For P-38s, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, would be the killer section, the ones tasked with shooting down the Admiral's plane. These 4 men would carry the weight of the entire operation on their shoulders. On the evening of April 17th, ground crews worked through the night preparing the P-38SC. Every possible ounce of weight was stripped from the aircraft. Guns were test-fired. Engines were tuned to perfection. Most critically, each Lightning was fitted with a 310-gallon drop tank, giving the aircraft just enough fuel to make the journey. The math was brutal. The round trip would consume nearly every drop of fuel. If the Americans encountered headwinds, if they had to fight for more than a few minutes, if they got lost and had to search for their target, they would run out of fuel over open ocean, hundreds of miles from friendly territory. The pilots knew the odds. They wrote letters home that night, just in case. At 7:10 a.m. on April 18th, 18 P-38 Lightnings roared down the runway at Henderson Field and climbed into the dawn sky. Mitchell led them in a wide turnout over the ocean, then dropped to just 50 feet above the waves. For the next hour and 47 minutes, the Americans would fly so low that salt spray coated their windows, so low that a moment's inattention could send them cartwheeling into the Pacific. Navigation was entirely on Mitchell's shoulders. There were no landmarks, no Haju beacons, nothing but endless blue water and the sun rising behind them. Mitchell flew by dead reckoning, using a compass, a stopwatch, and his own calculations of wind speed and direction. 1 degree off course, and they would miss Yamamoto entirely. 5 degrees off, and they would run out of fuel before finding their way home. The tension in those cockpits must have been unbearable. For nearly 2 hours, the pilots flew in radio silence, their eyes scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft, their minds calculating and recalculating their fuel consumption. Some of them later reported that it felt like flying into a void, like the ocean might stretch on forever with no target, no enemy, nothing but an empty sky and a slow death by fuel starvation. At exactly 9:33 a.m., Lieutenant Doug Canning, flying as Mitchell's wingman, broke radio silence. Bogies 11 o'clock high. They're exactly where intelligence had predicted. Exactly when the decoded message had said they would be. 2 Japanese Betty bombers flew in formation with 6 Zero fighters circling above them like protective angels. Inside the lead bomber, Admiral Yamamoto sat in his customary seat, likely reviewing reports or gazing at the jungle below, perhaps thinking about the war, about Japan's future, about the long road ahead. He had 11 minutes to live. Mitchell's voice cracked over the radio. "Skin him, boys. Go get him." The covering force, 14 P-38s, climbed hard into the Japanese fighters, drawing the Zeros away from the bombers. Instantly, the sky exploded into a furball of twisting, turning aircraft. Tracers laced the air. The sharp crack of cannon fire echoed over the engine roar. The Japanese pilots, caught completely by surprise, fought desperately to protect their admiral, but they had been out. The Americans had achieved the impossible tactical surprise against an enemy on high alert in their own territory. Meanwhile, Lanphier and Barber, with their wingman Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Lieutenant Ray Hain, dove toward the bombers. The 2 Bettys, suddenly aware of the danger, broke formation. One turned back toward the other. Yamamoto's plane dove for the jungle, the pilots desperately trying to reach the tree cover where the P-38s couldn't follow. What happened next became one of the most controversial moments in American military history, a controversy that would last decades and embitter friendships. Lanfear later claimed that he intercepted Yamamoto's bomber as it dove, that he fired a long burst from dead astern, that he saw his rounds tearing into the Betty's fuselage, that he watched the bomber trailing smoke and fire as it plunged into the jungle. His account painted him as the sole hero of Operation Vengeance, the man who killed Yamamoto, but Rex Barber told a different story. Barber claimed that Lanfear had been engaged with a Zero and never got a clean shot at Yamamoto's bomber. According to Barber, he was the one who caught the Betty in a diving attack, who raked it with machine gun and cannon fire, who saw the bomber's right engine explode into flames. Barber insisted that he, not Lanfear, had fired the fatal shots. The truth, we may never know with absolute certainty in the chaos of aerial combat with aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour. With gunsmoke and adrenaline clouding everything, even trained observers can have radically different perceptions of the same event. What we do know is this. At approximately 9:35 a.m., Yamamoto's bomber, riddled with American bullets, crashed into the jungle of Bougainville Island. The impact was catastrophic. The Betty disintegrated on contact, throwing debris across a quarter-mile of jungle. The second bomber suffered an equally brutal fate. It tried to escape by flying low over the water, but the remaining American fighters caught it and tore it apart. It crashed into the sea, killing everyone aboard. Both of Yamamoto's transport aircraft were destroyed in less than 3 minutes of combat. As the P-38s turned for home, fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels, the Japanese finally realized what had happened. Search parties were immediately dispatched to the crash site. It took them nearly a day to hack through the dense jungle and reach the wreckage. What they found was grim. Yamamoto's body was still strapped into his seat, which had been thrown clear of the main wreckage. He had been killed instantly, not by the crash, but by 2 bullets. One had struck him in the left shoulder blade, exiting through his chest. The other had entered his lower jaw and exited above his right eye. Either wound would have been fatal. He had died in the air, probably within seconds of the P-38's guns falling silent. The recovery team found Yamamoto still clutching his katana, his white-gloved hand locked in a death grip on the sword's hilt. His body was remarkably intact, preserved by some twist of fate, while the men around him had been torn apart by the crash. The Japanese carefully extricated their admiral's remains and transported them back to Tokyo with full military honors. Back at Henderson Field, the Americans were making desperate calculations of their own. Several P-38s landed with their fuel tanks completely dry, their engines coughing and dying as they rolled to a stop. One pilot later reported that his engine quit before he could taxi off the runway. They had quite literally flown until there was nothing left to burn. Of the 18 P-38s that launched, one was lost in combat, shot down by a Zero during the furious dogfight over The pilot, Lieutenant Ray Hain, was killed. Another P-38 was so badly damaged that it crashed on landing, though the pilot survived. But the mission, the audacious, impossible mission, had succeeded. Yamamoto was dead. For weeks, the Americans said nothing. They couldn't risk revealing that they had broken Japanese codes. Intelligence officers crafted elaborate cover stories, planting rumors that Australian coast watchers had spotted Yamamoto's flight, that the attack had been pure luck, a chance encounter. The Japanese, for their part, kept Yamamoto's death secret for over a month, not wanting to damage national morale by admitting they had lost their greatest naval commander. When Tokyo finally announced Yamamoto's death on May 21, 1943, the entire nation went into mourning. A state funeral was held with unprecedented pomp and ceremony. Over 1 million people lined the streets to watch Yamamoto's funeral procession. The emperor awarded him the highest military honors posthumously. To the Japanese public, Yamamoto had been killed in heroic combat, leading from the front, dying with his boots on. They never knew the truth, that American codebreakers had read their secret messages, that American fighters had flown an impossible distance to execute an assassination, that their admiral's punctuality and the rigid predictability of Japanese military protocol had created the opening for his death. The question that haunts historians even today is this: did killing Yamamoto actually change the course of the war? The immediate answer is complicated. Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Minachiko, was competent but lacked Yamamoto's strategic genius and his understanding of American capabilities. Under Koga's command, the Japanese Navy continued to lose ground, continued to make strategic blunders that Yamamoto might have avoided. But by April 1943, Japan was already losing the war. American industrial production was outbuilding Japanese shipyards by ratios that would have seemed impossible in 1941. The U.S. Navy was launching more aircraft carriers in a month than Japan had built in a decade. Some historians argue that Yamamoto alive might have negotiated a more favorable peace for Japan, that his understanding of American power and his prestige within the Japanese military might have allowed him to advocate for a diplomatic solution before Japan suffered complete destruction. Others argue that Yamamoto was too committed to total victory, too bound by Bushido code and personal honor to ever recommend surrender. What we can say with certainty is that Yamamoto's death had an immense psychological impact. For the Americans, it was a moment of pure vindication, payback for Pearl Harbor, delivered with surgical precision. For the Japanese, it was a devastating blow to morale, proof that no one, not even their greatest commander, was safe from American reach. On a tactical level, Operation Vengeance demonstrated capabilities that terrified the Japanese high command. If the Americans could fly 435 miles over open ocean, navigate with pinpoint accuracy, and execute an assassination in enemy airspace, what else could they do? Suddenly, Japanese commanders had to assume that their communications were compromised, that their codes were broken, that the Americans knew their every move. This paranoia, this loss of confidence in operational security, would hamper Japanese planning for the rest of the war. The numbers tell their own story. The mission required 18 P-38 Lightning fighters, 32 pilots, and ground crew members who knew the full details, and the coordination of intelligence services across 3 military branches. The flight itself covered 870 miles round trip, flown at altitudes between 50 and 10,000 feet, lasting 3 hours and 45 minutes from takeoff to landing. The actual combat phase, the moment when American and Japanese forces engaged, lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. 4 minutes that cost 1 American life and 17 Japanese lives. Consider this: Yamamoto's death came exactly 521 days after he launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, an attack that killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. In the grim arithmetic of war, in the calculus of revenge and retribution, Operation Vengeance might seem like a small payment against a massive debt, but war isn't about equal exchanges. It's about psychological dominance, about breaking the enemy's will to fight, about sending a message so clear and so brutal that it cannot be ignored. That message was this: you are not safe. You are not untouchable. We can reach you anywhere, at any time, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto's plane continued for decades. Thomas Lanphier spent the rest of his life claiming sole credit for the kill, giving interviews, writing articles, and becoming something of a celebrity based on his role in Operation Vengeance. Rex Barber, quieter and less interested in publicity, maintained that he was the true shooter, that Lanphier had embellished or outright fabricated his account. DUSC, military, uncomfortable with the dispute, eventually awarded both men credit for shooting down a bomber during the mission, carefully avoiding the question of whose bullets had actually killed Yamamoto. Other pilots who participated in the mission largely supported Barber's version of events, but the controversy was never fully resolved. Lanphier died in 1987, still claiming he had killed Yamamoto. Barber died in 2001, still insisting the credit was rightfully his. In some ways, the controversy misses the point. Operation Vengeance succeeded not because of any individual pilot's skill, but because of the coordinated efforts of dozens of people, the code breakers who deciphered Japanese messages, the intelligence analysts who recognized Yamamoto's itinerary for what it was, the mission planners who calculated the impossible navigation, the ground crews who prepared the aircraft, and all 18 pilots who flew into enemy territory knowing they might not return. Yamamoto's death was a team effort, a demonstration of American organizational capability and technological superiority. But humans love heroes. We love singular moments of bravery, individual acts that change history. So the argument continued, 2 men fighting over credit for a kill that, in the end, belonged to an entire nation's machinery of war. What kind of man was Isoroku Yamamoto? Understanding this is crucial to understanding why his death mattered so much. Yamamoto was born Isoroku Takano in 1884 in the small town of Naka. He was adopted into the Yamamoto family as a young man, taking their name as his own. As a young naval officer, he lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the naval engagement where Japan destroyed the Russian fleet and announced itself as a world power. That victory shaped Yamamoto's entire worldview. He believed in the decisive battle, the single engagement that could determine a war's outcome. He studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, during which time he traveled extensively across America, marveling at the industrial capacity and raw resources of the United States. He visited oil fields in Texas, car factories in Detroit, and steel mills in Pittsburgh. He returned to Japan convinced of one thing: if Japan went to war with America, it had to win quickly, in one devastating blow, before American industry could mobilize. A prolonged war with the United States was, in Yamamoto's view, unwinnable. This conviction led him to plan Pearl Harbor. He believed that destroying the American Pacific Fleet in a single surprise attack would so shock and demoralize the United States that America would sue for peace, accepting Japanese dominance in Asia rather than fighting a long, costly war. He was spectacularly wrong. Pearl Harbor didn't break American will, it transformed America from a nation reluctantly preparing for war into a nation absolutely committed to Japan's total destruction. Yamamoto knew this almost immediately. According to some accounts, when told that Japan had failed to deliver a declaration of war before the Pearl Harbor attack, making it a sneak attack in American eyes, Yamamoto said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said these exact words is disputed, but the sentiment accurately reflects his understanding of what Pearl Harbor had unleashed. By April 1943, Yamamoto was a man watching his strategic vision crumble. The war he had wanted to win in 6 months was now stretching into its second year, and America's industrial might was beginning to tell. Japanese carriers that took years to build were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Pilots who represented years of training were dying in numbers that Japan couldn't sustain. The empire was beginning its long, agonizing collapse. Did Yamamoto deserve to die? The question is almost meaningless in the context of total war. He was an enemy commander responsible for military operations that killed thousands of Americans. By the rules of war, he was a legitimate target. But there's something fundamentally different about an assassination, about hunting down a specific individual, about sending fighters across hundreds of miles of ocean with the sole purpose of killing one man. It's personal in a way that ordinary combat isn't. The Americans understood this. That's why they kept the mission secret for so long. Why they created elaborate cover stories. Why they never publicly celebrated Yamamoto's death the way they celebrated military victories. There was something almost uncomfortable about Operation Vengeance. Something that felt less like warfare and more like murder, even if it was entirely legal under the laws of war. The P-38 Lightning that made Operation Vengeance possible deserves its own recognition. Designed by Lockheed's legendary Kelly Johnson, the P-38 was one of the most distinctive aircraft of World War II. Its twin-boom design, with the cockpit and armament housed in a central nacelle between two engines, gave it both the range and the firepower necessary for the mission. Each P-38 carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, all firing forward. Unlike most fighters of the era, where guns were mounted in the wings and bullets converged at a specific distance, the P-38's nose-mounted weapons meant that all its fire came from a single point. This made it devastatingly accurate, capable of concentrating tremendous firepower on a small target. The Lightning's two Allison V1710 engines gave it a top speed of 414 miles per hour at altitude and a range with drop tanks of over 1,300 miles. It was this range that made it the only American fighter capable of reaching Yamamoto. Single-engine fighters like the F-4F Wildcat or F-4U Corsair simply couldn't carry enough fuel to make the journey. But the P-38 had its weaknesses. It was complex and expensive to build, requiring thousands of man-hours of skilled labor. Its twin engines meant twice the maintenance work, twice the chance of mechanical failure. And at high altitudes, the early P-38 models had a tendency to develop compressibility problems, where the aircraft would become difficult or impossible to control in a high-speed dive. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance were intimately familiar with these quirks and limitations. They had learned to coax maximum performance from their Lightnings, to manage fuel consumption, to handle the aircraft's peculiarities in combat. Without their skill and experience, the mission would have failed. After the war, the P-38 largely faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by more famous fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the F-4U Corsair. But for those who study Operation Vengeance, the Lightning remains the unsung hero of one of World War II's most audacious missions. In the decades since Operation Vengeance, Military historians and ethicists have debated the mission's morality. Was it acceptable to specifically target an enemy commander for assassination? Did it set a dangerous precedent? Did it violate the laws of war or the customs of honorable combat? The answers depend largely on one's perspective. Under international law, military commanders are legitimate targets in wartime. Yamamoto was not a civilian. He was the commander-in-chief of Japan's naval forces, actively engaged in planning and executing military operations. There's no legal prohibition against targeting such individuals. In fact, there's a strong argument that killing enemy commanders is more ethical than killing ordinary soldiers, because commanders bear greater responsibility for the war, and their deaths might shorten the conflict, saving lives overall. But there's something about the premeditated nature of Operation Vengeance that troubles some observers. This wasn't Yamamoto dying in a naval battle or being killed during a military operation he was commanding. This was a mission planned specifically to kill him, a mission that required presidential authorization, a mission that targeted one man among millions fighting the war. It feels different, more like an execution than combat. The Japanese certainly saw it that way. After the war, when the full details of Operation Vengeance became public, some Japanese veterans expressed outrage at what they viewed as a dishonorable ambush. They argued that Yamamoto should have been allowed to die in battle, in command of his fleet, not shot out of the sky while traveling between bases. This view, of course, ignores the fact that Japan had started the war with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a strike that the Japanese themselves designed to catch the Americans completely off guard. The truth is that war creates its own morality, its own logic. In total war, where entire nations mobilize for mutual destruction, where civilians die by the millions in bombings and sieges, the targeted killing of an enemy commander barely registers as a moral question. If anything, it's more discriminate, more precise, less destructive than the area bombings or naval battles that kill thousands of people at once. Operation Vengeance killed 17 people: Yamamoto, his staff, and the crews of the 2 bombers and several escort fighters. The Battle of Midway, which Yamamoto had planned and overseen, killed over 3,000 Japanese sailors. Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans. In the grim calculus of World War II, 17 deaths barely moves the needle as we look back more than 80 years later. Operation Vengeance stands as a testament to American capabilities in 1943, the ability to break enemy codes, to plan complex operations, to push military technology to its absolute limits, and to execute missions with a precision that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. It also stands as a reminder of the intensely personal nature of World War II, the way the conflict created individual rivalries and vendettas that outlasted the war itself. The controversy between Leinfear and Barber over who killed Yamamoto continued until both men died, a 40-year argument over credit for a kill that took less than 4 minutes to accomplish. The hatred many Americans felt for Yamamoto, the desire to personally avenge Pearl Harbor, drove the entire operation and colored how it was remembered afterward. And perhaps most importantly, Operation Vengeance demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful commanders. Yamamoto's death proved that no one was untouchable, that rigid adherence to protocol and schedule could be fatal, that in modern warfare, information was as deadly as any weapon. The Japanese learned, too late, that their codes were compromised, that their most secure communications had been an open book for American intelligence. The lesson echoes through military history. Adaptability, unpredictability, and information security are as crucial as firepower and courage. Yamamoto's punctuality, his habit of arriving exactly on schedule, created the conditions for his death. Had he delayed his flight by 10 minutes, had he changed his route, had he traveled at a different altitude or time, the entire operation would have failed. The Americans would have flown for nearly 2 hours, arrived at an empty sky, and returned to Guadalcanal with nothing to show for their effort. But Yamamoto was a man of routine, of discipline, of precise scheduling. And on April 18, 1943, his routine killed him. The legacy today, if you visit the jungle of Bougainville Island, you can still find fragments of Yamamoto's bomber scattered through the undergrowth. Locals occasionally discover pieces of wreckage, twisted aluminum, and shattered glass slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. A small memorial marks the crash site, visited by both American and Japanese tourists seeking to understand this moment when 2 nations' fates intersected in fire and violence. At Henderson Field, now largely abandoned and overgrown, you can stand on the same runway where 18 P-38s took off on an impossible mission. The jungle has reclaimed most of the base, but the runway remains cracked and pitted, a ghost of the desperate struggle for Guadalcanal. In Tokyo, Yamamoto is remembered as a hero, a brilliant commander who understood the costs of war and fought to defend his nation. His face appears in museums, his strategies are studied in military academies, his legacy is debated by historians seeking to understand how Japan could have avoided its catastrophic defeat. In America, Yamamoto occupies a complicated space in public memory. He is simultaneously the villain who planned Pearl Harbor and the tragic figure who knew Japan couldn't win a long war with the United States but was honor-bound to fight anyway. His death is celebrated as a moment of American ingenuity and determination, but also studied as an example of the costs of rigid military protocol and the dangers of predictability. Operation Vengeance changed the Pacific War in ways both measurable and subtle. It removed Japan's most capable naval commander at a crucial moment. It demonstrated American intelligence and operational capabilities that would only grow stronger as the war continued. It sent a message of American reach and resolve that echoed through Japanese command structures for the rest of the war. But perhaps most significantly, it proved that in modern warfare, distance provides no protection. That technology and intelligence can compress space and time. That the hunter and the hunted might be separated by hundreds of miles one moment and locked in mortal combat the next. Yamamoto understood this, perhaps better than any other Japanese commander. He had studied American industry, had seen American technological innovation firsthand, had warned his superiors that a long war with the United States would be a disaster for Japan. And yet, bound by duty and honor, he had planned and executed Pearl Harbor, awakening the very force he feared most. On April 18, 1943, 435 miles from Rabaul, 4,500 feet above the jungles of Bougainville, that force caught up with him. 18 P-38 Lightnings, guided by broken Japanese codes and flown by pilots who had survived the crucible of Guadalcanal, executed one of the most daring assassination missions in military history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, died as he had lived, precisely on schedule, exactly where he was supposed to be, doing his duty to the very end. His final moment was probably instant, probably painless, probably without any understanding that the Americans had flown across an ocean to kill him specifically. The war would continue for another 2 years and 4 months. Millions more would die, cities would burn, atomic weapons would be unleashed. The world would be forever changed. But on that bright morning in April 1943, in the skies over the Solomon Islands, just as wore American colors and flew at 350 miles per hour. And the architect of Pearl Harbor fell from the sky, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance, tragedy, and what might have been. If this story of one of World War II's most audacious operations captivated you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the missions, battles, and individuals that shaped history. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments which World War II story you want us to cover next. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just dates and facts, it's human stories of courage, consequence, and the moments that changed everything.